Yes, and more than that actually is that the detective novel, the seafaring novel, young adult fiction, all of these things do not exist in Philippine reading. In Philippine literature, we don't have those traditions. For some reason, we're so entrenched in the very Marxist, social realist type of novel because we're a poor country and we've had a very long tradition of nationalism. And so what I wanted to do is create an author, Crispin Salvador, who did write these genres and did blaze some trails with these forms in hopes that this would, show other Filipino writers that, well, we can do it. Also because I was lazy and I didn't want to do it myself. So it was just...
But Alberto, with one thing which struck me about both books is the club in your book, the Martin Fierro.
Yes. This is a club of exiles, of Argentinian exiles in Spain. And the club carries the name of the Argentinian national epic poem, the Martin Fierro.
It's strange the way in which countries are so identified with one particular cultural construct. With Martin Fierro, in the case of Argentina, you've had to create this character, Crispin, as the line of Philippines literature. Do you think that's something that's a reflection of how blinkered we are in the Anglophone world, that we want to sort of think that every country is just one author and one that we can sort of say, well, that's that kind of literature?
Yes.
I mean, it's certainly something I think that we have in Scotland, that people would say, Scotland, you've got Alistair Gray, that's enough. And again, very interesting parallels with the rush onto magic realism. So if you could talk a little bit about, this identification of particular authors with particular countries and how that holds us back.
Well, hopefully those people aren't in this room today. But yes, in the Philippines, we're known for Imelda Marcos, or we're known for...
And her shoes.
And her shoes, especially her shoes. And maids, unfortunately. And we're all those things, but a whole lot more. And this is what I try to write about in my book. But I think it's just because, well, there's so many things to read and watch and do that it's easy to kind of adhere to one person who represents a country and stick to that. But I hope good readers aren't like that. What do you think, Alberto?
Well, of course, I hope that too. But it is true that from outside, there is always a tendency towards a certain kind of intellectual laziness, which makes you look for something that will sum the country up or the culture up or the writer up, and especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, there is that tendency. But well, I think we would have to get into discussions of what then is a national culture. I believe that in Scotland you have quite a bit of this discussion. We certainly had it in Argentina, you have it in the Philippines. I think that when you try to understand who you are in terms of where you are, you begin to look for pointers in the world that you know. And the danger is that those pointers, instead of becoming elements from which you begin to build something, they become walls within which you enclose yourself, shut yourself off from the rest of the world, and then see nothing except what is within those walls.
In both books as well, there's a very strong identification between the kind of writing that's being produced and the politically repressive climates that they emerge in. I mean, one thing in your book, Alberto, the fact that these people are fleeing Argentina and arriving under the dying days of Franco, it seems, changing from one tyranny to another. And I wondered, was that a conscious theme that you wanted to look at, this relationship between political repression and...
The first version of the novel in English, I had the exiled writer Alejandro Bevilacqua flee to Canada. And the reason it didn't work was that everyone was too kind to him in Canada. Canada is a very generous country, and Canada is the only country in the whole of the American continent that wasn't born from a revolution, but from a counter-revolution. from the desire of not becoming independent. So in Canada, we have a notion of identity that is open to everyone who wants to be Canadian. So if you happen to land in a Canadian airport, immediately you are Canadian, and whatever it is that you bring with you becomes part of Canada, which is a good thing but difficult to maintain. I'll just bracket this to tell you a joke, but this really happened. The Canadian radio had a competition to find the equivalent in Canada to as American as apple pie. And the winning entry was as Canadian as possible under the circumstances. But I profoundly like, and I'm very proud of that aspect of Canadianism. The fact that Miguel and myself are Canadian, and nobody says, but how can you be Canadian with this name, or if you were born somewhere else? That doesn't matter to Canada. So in Canada, it's easier to reflect in a deeper, more complex way on your identity and the identity of your community. It's much more difficult in other places. For instance, now in France, it's becoming impossible with the Ministry for National Identity and the president declaring that Roms are persona non grata in France.
Alberto, do you think the Canadians are that way because they themselves are searching for an identity? So they're far more open to having people come in and join them in that quest.
I think that Canadians are trying very hard to maintain the idea of identity open. That is to say, Canadian means whatever it is that is happening today now, and whoever comes in and wants to be Canadian will bring Filipino culture to be part of Canada. There is, I don't want this whole session to be about Canada, but let me tell you an anecdote. As you know, the symbol of Canada, as in Scotland, the kilt and the bagpipes, in Canada, it's the Mountie with his red uniform and his flat hat. Well, with the different immigrations to Canada, there was a Sikh immigration, and of course, if you're Canadian, you can become part of the mounted police, and a Sikh became a Mountie. But of course, Sikhs cannot remove their turbans. So how can you be a Mountie without your hat? Well, it was simply decided that the uniform would change. And so we have Mounties with turbans. Now that can only happen in Canada. I can't imagine somebody wanting to become Scottish and saying, I'll replace your bagpipes with a Japanese lute.
I was thinking of wearing leggings with my kilt, just because I get drafty. But no, the reason I was asking about Canada is because in the Philippines, a foreigner, say a Scotsman or an Argentine, can come and live in the Philippines, marry a Filipina, have lots of Filipino children, invest millions of dollars into the society, but they can never, for as long as they live, become Filipino. They can never take their citizenship. And I think that's very tightly wound up with the idea that we're a culture that, because we have the post-colonial experience, or the colonial then post-colonial experience, we're trying to find, we're very jealously guarding our own culture. And you know, in my book, I try to play with that. A lot of people have said the book is about Philippine identity. I chart 150 years of Philippine history. But to me, what I'm trying to say is, well, we are who we are. We're Filipino. We're all of these things. Get over it. And in your book, it felt like the characters didn't have any issues about who they were.
Because you don't argue about it. You're born in Argentina. You're Argentinian. You can never relinquish that nationality. I'm Canadian, but I'm still Argentinian for the Argentines. Spanish is Spanish. Those things are simply there. But as you say, as with the Philippines, you cannot become Argentinian. You cannot become Spanish. You certainly can't become Scottish, can you?
Edward Waverley does in Waverley. He's the Englishman that becomes a Scotsman. And frankly, anyone can wear a kilt.
Yes, but would you recognize it as...
I think it is
would.
beginning to change
Yes.
slightly.